This week on The Big Story, Britain has been in Africa for hundreds of years, and during that time it's brought the continent good governance, democracy, and pulled millions of people out of poverty. Or has it?
Britain has a range of interests. In fact, they haven't changed much over the years. The key interests are obviously economic on the one hand and strategic on the other.
We've seen that really over the last 30 years that in many cases Africa has gone backwards rather than forwards. So, you know, the facts speak for themselves.
Has colonialism died, or is the exploitation of Africa still as prevalent as ever?
So African people are not actually benefiting from the riches of Africa. There's no reason on this earth we should still be talking about poverty in Africa. Africa is not poor, but Africa's riches are benefiting everyone else disproportionately rather than African people.
Britain can't alone be the only country that doesn't bribe. If 10% to go into the governor's pocket is the only way to do business, and you can ask the Germans, you can ask the French, you can ask the Americans, don't just pick on the British and say that we are somehow not people to do business with. It's the African culture that determines this, not the British.
Britain has had a long and complicated history of involvement in Africa. The UK opened Africa up to new ideas and the rule of law, but Britain has also been accused of leading the charge to plunder African resources and her people. So what about now? What are Britain's interests in Africa?
Well, Britain has a range of interests. In fact, they haven't changed much over the years. The key interests are obviously economic on the one hand and strategic on the other. As far as the economic relationship goes, South Africa has long been, the most important partner, but also there are important oil interests, for example, in Angola, in Nigeria. And then there are strategic interests. In the Cold War, there was an interest in promoting Western interests as opposed to Soviet, in the context of the Cold War global power struggle, and now that has mutated into a strategic interest in dealing with the so-called threat of Islamist terrorism.
By the time Britain ended hundreds of years of direct rule on the continent, Africa's nations ranked amongst the poorest on earth. This idea of self-interest chimes heavily against Britain's publicly stated aims of helping Africa develop and bring itself out of poverty. It seems to be an accepted fact amongst the British that the UK are in Africa to help its people. Britain's Department for International Development, or DFID, provides £5.5 billion in aid to developing countries every year. Africa receives just over half of this amount. This aid is in addition to hundreds of millions raised independently by British charities working on the continent. This money is often given to countries Britain considers their strategic and security partners and ones who follow the Western economic model.
The problem is the amount given in aid is dwarfed by the amount of capital lost from developing countries. And the other point is when aid is conditional on economic activity in those countries, which means maybe cutting the public sector, when aid is delivered through security. So where that becomes a big issue, we certainly know in many countries in the world now the aid agenda is used to promote a security agenda and not necessarily a development agenda. There are many problems with the aid model, and many people have given incredibly good analysis of those. For me, the key issue though is not about aid, it's about tax and redistribution and the rights of countries to develop their own model.
In terms of the aid businesses, I think the aid businesses are, the aid agencies are very effective when they are doing relief work. If there's a disaster and you need to move in, very quickly, offer relief to people, and they do a wonderful job in responding to those kind of crises. I'm less convinced that over the longer term, in terms of doing development, that they are as effective. And we've seen that really over the last 30 years that in many cases Africa has gone backwards rather than forwards. So the facts speak for themselves.
Dambisa Moyo, author of the book Dead Aid, estimates that over the past 5 decades, sub-Saharan Africa has received over $1 trillion in aid. 50 years later, the continent is poorer than it was prior to the delivery of that aid. Esther Stanford is a Pan-African activist who agreed to brave the London coal to have a chat with us.
I think we need to blow the lid on this question of aid. Aid is a fraud, really, because what we're talking about is, continued extraction of African resources for a very low price. And then it's sold back to us as though Britain and other European nations are actually doing something for African people. I would say it's very difficult to find any genuine examples of best practice, on the ground. And some people might consider that to be a cynical view, but there is the whole African movement for restoration of African resources, what we call debt repudiation, as opposed to aid, because this whole notion of giving something to African people, when we know that for every pound and every dollar that is invested, there's been studies that have shown that up to 10 pounds or dollars is extracted from the continent. So it looks like something is being done to help African people on the ground, and I'm sure, yes, on a small scale you'll find little development projects, some questions of microfinancing and so forth, and yes, individual families may feel that they're doing much better. But if we look at what's really happening on a bigger scale, what we're seeing is the mortgaging of Africans' future.
One of the main issues surrounding aid delivery to Africa is what happens to the funds meant to go to the poorest in some of the most deprived countries on the continent. Recently, Bob Geldof, the pop star who organized Live Aid concerts to raise money for Ethiopia's starving millions, threatened to sue the BBC after they reported that money given to the Live Aid charity in 1985 had been diverted to fund rebel groups. It seems only 5% of the £100 million destined for famine relief in Tigray, North Ethiopia, ended up feeding the hungry. According to Ethiopian sources, the other 95% went to a rebel group fighting the government. A recent UN report also discovered that half of the food aid to Somalia was routinely diverted, with private individuals or companies profiting. Rwanda has also been accused of diverting money from rebuilding projects to arming Congolese militia in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Who gets what is decided by DFID, an arm of the British government.